Good afternoon and welcome to the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority's National Science Week session on protecting biodiversity. My name is Dr Mel Cowlishaw and I'm a marine scientist with the authority. To start off, I would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional owners and custodians of the country on which this event is taking place, and as the custodians of the Great Barrier Reef and its adjacent catchment. We recognise their connection to land, sea and community, and we pay our respects to them, their cultures and to their elders past, present and emerging. For all of you joining us virtually today, you can pop in any questions that you would like to ask into the chat function and we'll endeavour to get to them throughout the webinar or at the end during our Q&A session. But today I would like to introduce you to four of my dedicated and highly skilled colleagues here at the Authority, Dr Jess Steller, Dr Mark Reid and Tom Hatley. Together, they will share with you their expertise on the Authority's collaborative approach to protecting the reef's biodiversity. So I'll start with you, Jess. Dr Jess Steller is a marine scientist with the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. Her role is all about ensuring reef managers have the most up-to-date science and information available to them to inform their decision-making. Jess, can you tell us, what is your favourite animal out on the reef?
Well, Mel, anyone who knows me would know that I'm completely infatuated with coral guard crabs. I became aware of them during my PhD. There's several species on the GBR, but they all specialize on living coral, so particularly branching coral. They're small, they're beautifully patterned, but they're extremely feisty. The coral is their home, and it's also their source of food. And they actively defend it from much larger organisms that would try to eat it, such as crown of thorn starfish. They actively go to battle with crown of thorns. So they're the David and Goliath story on the reef. So yeah, they're my favorite.
Thanks, Jess. Now, Tom Hatley is part of our reef education and stewardship team. His role involves working with fishers and the Queensland State Government fisheries managers to identify and address issues to ensure fishing activities on the reef are as environmentally friendly and sustainable as possible. So Tom, as someone who works closely with the community and industry, what has inspired you most about the changes industry has made to protect the biodiversity of the reef?
Well, one of the things that I find really inspiring is the fishers themselves, the guys who are out there almost every day on the water of the reef, understanding and appreciating the environment that they're in, and then doing their best in their operations to make them as sustainable as possible, and trialing new gears, undertaking new practices, and the energy they bring to that, and being able to share their stories with other people is really good. And just being able to meet them, hear their stories, and then use that to help bring up the standard of all operations is really good.
Thanks, Tom. And finally, we have Dr Mark Reid, who is part of the Reef Joint Field Management Program and has spent over 20 years studying and working on the Great Barrier Reef. His role involves a mixture of strategic planning and policy work, as well as the in-the-field work to drive conservation and management outcomes. Mark, can you tell us a little bit about your most memorable encounter on the Great Barrier Reef, please?
G'day, Mel. G'day, everyone coming in this afternoon. I'd have to say one of the most memorable encounters I've ever had was that I was on a charter boat heading up to Rain Island, which is one of the world's largest green turtle rookeries. And we were crossing this expanse of ocean between reefs, and there were 3 whale sharks on the surface feeding in between the 2 reefs. Had the amazing opportunity to put on the snorkeling gear and jump over the side with these 3 whale sharks and actually swim in amongst them for about 40 minutes while they were feeding on the surface. And one of these animals was probably greater than 10 metres long, and so to be able to be up close and personal with such a big fish and just be in awe of the way that they just glide through the water is a memory I've always treasured.
Thanks, Mark. That's very special. The variety of life along the Great Barrier Reef's vast expanse is immense. The reef's extraordinary biodiversity and its interconnectedness of species and habitats makes the Great Barrier Reef and surrounding areas one of the most complex natural systems on Earth. Maintaining a healthy and diverse Great Barrier Reef ecosystem is important to help it withstand, recover, and adapt to impact and stress. A productive and healthy reef environment provides essential resources such as fish and prawns and supports many industries. And today, together with Jess, Tom and Mark, we're going to talk a little bit about how we as the authority protect biodiversity out within the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and also give you an insight on how they've come into the positions that they have and the choices they've taken throughout their career. So Jess, I might start with you. Are you able to explain the role that the structure of the reef and coral reef habitat play in supporting biodiversity and why it's so important to protect it?
Sure, Mel. One thing to understand is that coral reef habitats contain more biodiversity in terms of ecosystems more than rainforests. So they're very high concentrated areas of biodiversity. There's 32 out of the 34 known animal phyla that occur on coral reefs, and they support at least 25% of the ocean species, yet they only cover about 0.1% of the ocean floor. And all of that structure provides a 3D matrix for animals to shelter in. It protects them from predation, provides safe sites for them to mate, to lay eggs, to breed, and also to feed. So the animals that you find in the reef matrix can range from size from copepods, which are just larger than microscopic, to sharks, such as tawny nurse sharks that you'd find napping or resting within the reef matrix. Without that structure, the biodiversity would be a lot less. So if you think about the ocean floor where there is absolutely no structure but sand, most of the animals will dwell in the sand. So the complex reef structure is really what maintains and supports that biodiversity. And the reason it's so important to protect it, we really just don't know how many species there are on the reef. So we'd like to protect as many as we can in order to protect an ecological function that they may perform. So by protecting more species, we can ensure that we have commercially important species on the dinner plates, that we have species that are performing important ecological roles for other species and maintaining reef function. So we're just trying to cover all of our bases by protecting that biodiversity.
Thanks. And Mark, as you shared, the reef is home to some amazing and unique protected species. Can you tell us a little bit about them and their current status?
No worries, Mel, and thanks. It's a really good question, and in many ways it sort of really epitomises the work that we do. Is that, you know, as scientists and researchers within the Marine Park Authority, one of our jobs is to understand the breadth of that biodiversity, and at any one time have an idea about how their populations are travelling. Are they going up? Are they going down? You know, what are the things that threaten those populations? And I think in many ways that's one of the cool things that we do, is trying to understand those things, and also trying to get that information from a diverse range of sources, Mel. So, you know, it really depends on the group of animals when it comes to how they're travelling. If you think about marine turtles, it's an animal that I'm really familiar with. We've got 6 species that are counted within the marine park. Of those, a couple are actually in, you know, they're in dire straits. The leatherback turtle is really in decline. The hawksbill turtle is also in decline. And that's also offset by, you know, one of the groups of green turtles, the genetic group, the Southern Great Barrier of green turtle stock, that's been going up by just under 4% for about 50 years. Some of the whales are doing really well. The humpback whale, if we go back, say, probably 5 decades, was hunted to the stage where there was only sort of between 300 and 500 going up the Eastern Australian coastline. That population is now estimated to be somewhere around 35,000 humpbacks travelling along the Eastern Australian coastline up into the Great Barrier Reef. So there's some real success stories, and there's also some stories that indicate these animals have got some problems, which is one of the reasons why it's really refreshing working for the Marine Park Authority, because we can actually make a difference.
And Mark, the marine park is what we refer to as a multiple use area. It's used for traditional, recreational, commercial and research purposes. Can you tell the audience a little about the zoning arrangements that are in place that are designed to manage and protect the values and the parts of the reef that people enjoy?
Yeah, no, once again, it's a really good question. I think in many ways it's also, you can start to explain that complex management structure by almost drawing the analogy to town planning, Mel, in terms of how you go about protecting the reef. It's very similar to how you go about managing a city or a small town. You've got to have planning instruments that operate at a variety of scales. So for us in the Great Barrier Reef Park, we've got the zoning plan, which covers the entirety of the reef. The zoning plan is a really crucial tool for us because it's able to manage those sort of competing uses between the different groups of people at that broad scale, but also down to a really fine scale. And so I suppose to illustrate that, one of the zones that we've got is what's called a preservation zone. So it's a pink zone on your zoning map. And there's very few of those, but they're really crucial in terms of they're usually around either a reef or an island and reef complex that's really, really critically important. So we've got Millman Island in the Northern Great Barrier Reef, which is the largest horsespool rookery in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And the waters surrounding Millman are actually designated as a peak zone to protect the horsebill turtles in between crawling up on the beach and laying their eggs. But we've also got other tools that we can use. So we've got these things called plans of management. We've got one down in the Whitsundays and we've got one around Cairns and Port Douglas. And that just allows us to drill down to a finer scale and in particular to be able to control or regulate particular activities within those areas. And so both the Whitsundays and Cairns, that's really about supporting the tourism industry and making sure that there is an equitable use of the resources to support that industry and minimise competition. So that's just a couple of examples of the tools that we use to manage the reef and zone the reef.
Thanks, Mark. And Tom, I've got a question for you now. We all play a role in protecting the reef. Can you share with the audience what the fishing industry is doing to reduce its impacts and protect reef biodiversity?
Yeah, look, there's some really good examples of both recreational and commercial fishers taking the initiative to make their practices as ecologically sustainable as possible. So some of the commercial fishers, including people who are accredited or recognised by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority as reef guardian fishers, do things like allow researchers on their vessel, their time, their resources to undertake research into things like bycatch reduction devices, turtle exclusion devices. I'm thinking of trawl fishermen in that case. There's net fishermen who've done some really innovative work with their nets in terms of breakaway panels and looking at the way they use their nets to avoid interactions with things like dugongs and dolphins. And there's also reef line fishermen who are anchoring on reefs or working around reefs who are trialling things like electric motors or really more sensitive anchoring techniques to protect coral from damage from anchor damage. So there's lots of examples and I guess it's just an approach where a lot of people doing that and a lot of different fishermen coming together to do that and share those ideas is really important. I did forget to mention as well that recreational sector doing things like only catching and retaining what they need, pledging to be really careful with what they take, and so that's another example where fishing groups, not just individuals, are getting together and looking at the way they're operating and their activities and being really considerate about their extraction from the park and other interaction with the greater environment.
Thanks, Tom. Now, Jess, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority has quite a few scientists on staff. I'm just wondering if you can tell us why that's so important in protecting the reef's biodiversity.
Well, I guess it's important to have so many scientists because often they have to translate a lot of the science into knowledge that is usable for management. So a lot of the scientists that work at GBRMPA act as knowledge brokers. So working closely with scientists and at the interface between the science and the policy. And that helps us to make evidence-based decisions. So put into actions for management that actually make sense from a scientific point of view and vice versa. So having that scientific knowledge and going back and forth between science and policymakers just helps to increase that exchange of knowledge and information. and also helps in the communication of complex ideas. So protecting the reef's biodiversity is one of our goals because it's one of the criterion that got the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage listed. So it's obviously one of our very important assets that we want to look after. So utilizing all of the knowledge that we have in the Marine Park Authority as well as with scientists is really, really important. So having that scientific knowledge makes it a lot easier.
Thanks, Jess. And Tom, Jess just spoke a little bit about knowledge brokerage there, and I understand that there's some research being undertaken in the protected species space to make sure that, you know, to better understand their patterns and behaviours to minimise human interactions. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about that and your role in it, please?
Sure. So one of the issues with trying to manage things like, say, netting interactions or trawl fishing interactions with things like turtles, dugongs, dolphins is working out where they're most likely to occur and then putting in strategies to avoid those areas or make sure practices are sensitive to the animals in that area. And at the moment, what we're working on is bringing together some more spatial information and better spatial information around some inshore dolphin species, snubfin dolphin and Australian humpback dolphin, and also shorefishes, which is there's also been a massive decline along the GBR coast of sawfish from historic levels. So it's working out where the highest abundances of those animals are through spatial modelling, and then bringing all the information together holistically and really drilling down to hotspots of high habitat usage of protected species, and then everyone putting their thinking caps on about how to best manage fishing activities in those areas.
Thanks, Tom. Now, Mark, the Great Barrier Reef is not just all about corals and fish. There's also over 1,000 islands. It's important that we take a landscape approach to protecting biodiversity. And the Reef Joint Field Management Program has a number of projects designed to restore the reef's biodiversity. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about these?
Yeah, Mel, thank you. And that is one of the really interesting points, is the fact there's about 1,050 islands, of which we manage the Reef Joint Field Management Program as part of the Marine Park Authority. We manage about 460 of those. And so, you know, like many other environments around the world, we've seen some of these islands be fairly badly degraded by fairly destructive practices like guano mining, where they dig up the phosphate produced by nesting seabirds, by the introduction of feral animals like goats, pigs on some of these islands, even chickens on a couple of islands as well. And you know, the introduction of feral animals and weeds can simply change the whole landscape on those islands. So a really nice example is there's a lovely little coral cay off the coast of Gladstone called Trine Island, which has a really unique vegetation on there called Pisonia forests. And what we found is that because of the introduction of one of the invasive tramp ants on Trine Island, they suddenly started essentially defending the native scale insects on the Pisonia, and the scale insects reproduced to the stage where they're actually defoliating the Pisonia trees. So we actually got to the stage where over 95% of the Pisonia on Trine Island had actually been defoliated by the scale insects. And so we embarked on a program using some wonderful volunteers where we actually baited the island to get rid of the ants. We started to introduce the native predators of the scale insects, ladybirds and some wasps. And we planted over 3,500 cuttings of Pisonia across Trine Island. We started that project in 2006, and now I'm really excited to say that we've gone back repeatedly looking for those tramp ants, and it looks as though they've been completely eliminated from the island. 95% of the original Pisonia cover has now been replanted, and it's actually grown to the stage where Pisonia is 3 to 4 metres tall, and it's actually shading out all the weeds that used to grow underneath it. And that means there's all the habitat available for birds like wedge-tailed shearwaters. So it's a really nice example of, you know, taking that landscape approach, a bit of intervention work, and then actually bringing the natural values of that island back to the stage where that's actually supporting other critical elements of biodiversity.
Thanks, Mark. That is a great example. Now, we do have a question here from Josh in the audience who's made the comment that all the panelists seem to have dream jobs for many young people looking for careers in ocean conservation. And I guess he's wondering what tips you have for people trying to gain a footing in this field when the competition for jobs is so high. I'm just wondering if each of you can share with the audience a bit about your career path to date and the qualifications you hold. Jess, I might start with you.
Sure. I guess my advice to him, first of all, would be don't be afraid to get your hands dirty and do the, I guess, the less desirable jobs in order to get a footing. So I started my marine biology career working as an intern for the Bermuda Aquarium and Zoo. I think one of my first jobs was actually cleaning fish poo out of the tanks. So not very glamorous and not really how I pictured it, but I learned a lot of practical skills in that volunteer program. So animal husbandry, as well as how to do coral and seagrass surveys, a lot of species identification. So lots of practical skills, as well as doing my scuba diver qualifications. So I think that you need to acknowledge that it's not a very glamorous job. I guess it is my dream job because I really care about the reef. So I'm very passionate about what I do, but it's definitely not all glamorous. Got to get your hands dirty, and sometimes you have to do things that you may find unpleasant at the time, but is actually going to be worthwhile in teaching you that lesson you need to learn to move ahead.
Thanks, Jess. And what about you, Mark? Any cleaning fish poo in your career history?
Well, Mel, I actually did my PhD on analysing crocodile poo, so I'm exactly in the same boat as Jess. I've got that broad range of experience. I'd say that, you know, I sort of went through university, did a bachelor's degree, honours degree, and then a PhD. Number one, you've got to be really committed to go through with that sort of level of qualification. But probably the thing I'd say to everybody, and the tip that really worked for me, is that make sure you always take the opportunity to volunteer for people or for organisations that are closely aligned to the field that you want to get into. Because like Jess was saying, that just gives you the opportunity to pick up so many amazing skills that you wouldn't have otherwise picked up. It gives you the opportunity to learn some of the soft skills, like, you know, how do you talk to people? How do you communicate science? How do you break down complex messages into readily digestible stories that you can tell people? But it also means that you then start to build that network of people who might actually be your future employer. And that's exactly the way it worked for me, is that I volunteered at the Queensland Museum in their herpetology section for 3 years while I was doing my undergrad degree. That then allowed me to meet a guy called Dr Cowlishaw, who was an international recognised marine turtle biologist, who then offered me the opportunity to do an honours degree with him. And later on, when I went for a job as a crocodile biologist, it just so happened that Cowlishaw was sitting on the opposite side of the interview table asking me questions. So building the network, doing the volunteering to get the practical experience and get to meet some really important people and get that mentoring would be one of the critical things advice I'd give people.
Thanks, Mark. And Tom, how about you?
Look, I've really got a similar message, and that is get out and do other things than if you're pursuing, academic studies. Do other things. Look at other places where you can learn stuff. So for me, one of the things that I did is I've always been really passionate about fishing and fisheries, and so before and after and during uni or university studies, I went and worked on commercial fishing vessels. Now, you know, I pursued a few other things through time, but now I'm in a place where I'm working with fishing industry, and that experience back there I can draw on to communicate with fishermen and fisheries managers. And I never would have seen that happening, or I didn't know where I was going to end up. So, but now I'm really grateful for it. So that's my message, is just get out there and pursue other interests as well as what you might be studying.
Thanks. And there's also a question here from Holly. She wants to know what is the best place to visit on the reef? Tom, what are your tips?
Look, I really think if you can get the opportunity, try and get out to mid and outer shelf reefs, with the water clarity and some of just the stunning things you'll see underwater. That would be my tip, is to, if you've got the opportunity and you can get out to those mid and outer shelf reefs. The fish life, the coral, just incredible, mind blowing.
And Jess, where has been your favourite places to visit? You're on mute, Jess.
I would have to say that some of the reefs up by Princess Charlotte Bay that I had the opportunity to survey during a bleaching event in 2016. I know that sounds really bad, but seeing coral bleaching for the first time was, it was incredibly beautiful. Everything was glowing and it was sparkling white. Knowing what it meant was terrible knowledge, and watching those coral reefs degrade over the series of a few months of doing surveys. But when I first jumped in the water and saw them, my breath left me. I'd never seen anything like it before. I hope I never see anything like it again. Once I think was enough, but it was definitely a memory that'll stay with me forever.
Thanks. And Mark, we've got a question here from Kimberly, who says that she's also had the pleasure of swimming with whale sharks in Western Australia, but is wondering if there are any places on the reef where the public might get a chance to see these incredible creatures. Does that rank in one of your best places to visit the reef?
Yeah, look, it does, Mel. I mean, one of the differences between Western Australia and Queensland is that we don't have a readily identifiable location where we get those annual aggregation of whale sharks that you can actually go and have at least a reasonably guaranteed chance of being able to see these magnificent animals. They're a little bit more randomly spread throughout the marine park. So you've got to be, and sometimes you've actually just got to be lucky, plain old lucky, to be in the right place at the right time. But if I was to describe one of my favourite places to visit, I'm going to buck the trend a little bit. And I'm actually going to talk, I reckon, the mangrove forests that are essentially the interface between the land and the ocean are just some of the most extraordinary places to go and visit, to be able to watch the tide come in and out, watch the fish and turtles and crabs and those sorts of things playing around in those areas, but also to be exposed to the wonderful number of bird species that you get in the mangrove forests. For me, it's a really dynamic place. And we often don't have a lot of competition in the mangroves, Mel, because they're pretty stinky and they're full of things like sandflies and mosquitoes, but they're really, really fascinating places.
And Mark, I might ask you this question as well. So Jules has rightly noted that sharks are apex predators, which aid biodiversity. And she's just wondering a little bit more about the arrangements for the drumlines that are in place within the marine park.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Jules. Thank you. I mean, it's always a very, very complex interplay between managing a marine park, managing bather safety, and also protecting biodiversity. So there's a really, I would say there's a very well-structured, well-considered program that has apparatus in place to really try and target those animals that pose the greatest risk to human life. You know, at one stage there used to be a series of shark nets in the marine park, but we found that there was a real high degree of interaction between a whole range of non-target species, things like turtles and dolphins and stingrays, and those nets. So there was a progressive program to remove the nets, replace them with drumlines, which are far more target specific. It's never an easy situation because of the conflicting use. But ultimately, you know, interactions between sharks and people can be truly catastrophic. And we obviously want to provide a situation where people can come and enjoy the marine park, recognise the biodiversity, recognise and respect the fact that sharks have got a place to live, but also to have that element of safety there as well.
Thanks, Mark. Now, we've spoken a little bit about World Heritage listing and how the Great Barrier Reef is recognised for its outstanding universal value. I'm just wondering if each of you can tell us a little bit about, you know, how you apply the concept of World Heritage in your jobs. So, Mark, I might just start with you.
I mean, one of the two of the species that were actually used in the original argument for inscribing the Great Barrier Reef as a World Heritage Property are dugongs and marine turtles. So it was actually recognised that the Great Barrier Reef supports one of the largest remaining populations of dugongs in the world, and that we also had 7 species of marine turtle that could be found within the World Heritage Property. So for me, on a regular basis, I think about the fact that we have this amazing, unique property that we've been given this fantastic opportunity to look after. And I actually see some of those World Heritage values swimming around some of the islands and seagrass meadows that I travel over quite frequently. So for me, it's a really nice reminder of why we do the jobs we do.
Thanks, Mark. And Tom, how does the concept of World Heritage play out in the work that you do with industries?
Well, look, one of the things that's apart from some of the really large iconic species is just the diversity that we have on the GBR, and just the diversity of habitats. And as much as it is our job is to look after things like iconic species, it's also just to protect biodiversity. And so that might be a habitat that's like a fringing coral reef in a particular area, or perhaps it might even be a sponge garden or sea whips. And so in my work, it's identifying those areas, and it's also looking at activities that might impact them and trying to find a middle ground where you can preserve as much of that biodiversity, understanding that it's a multi-use marine park. So there's going to be people, and wherever there's people, there are impacts on the environment. So what I like to think about is the fact that you're trying to just get everyone on the same page to protect as much of that unique biodiversity as you can.
Thanks, Tom. And Jess, from your perspective in that sort of knowledge brokerage role with science and researchers, how do we give consideration to the various attributes that make up World Heritage?
Well, Mel, as you know, the Great Barrier Reef is more than just coral. So there are a lot of unique habitats in the Great Barrier Reef. And one of the reasons that sites are judged to be World Heritage areas is because they are considered to be to have outstanding value to humanity. And I think that's something that we all tend to keep in mind when we see these habitats and we go underwater and we see the amount of species that are there. I have this very strong feeling of custodianship towards looking after this and looking after it for future generations. And I think we all do. We all have that strong connection to the reef. And that's really important for people to protect it, because people protect what they love. And if they love the reef, they will protect it. So in terms of its World Heritage site, sometimes it's just a reminder that this is a very special place on Earth, and there's hardly any other places like it. So I feel very, very lucky to work here.
Thanks, Jess. I think we all do. I'll just check in with our technical people to make sure we've covered off on all the questions. And if, sorry?
Yes, I think we have. Someone was just asking about how much experience you'd need to make a living, and that's an interesting question, a very hard one to answer.
That is a hard one to answer. Does anyone, I guess it also depends on the standard of living that you'd like. So does anyone of the panel wish to answer that one? Given it
depends on where you want to go, I guess. So I started with an undergrad, and I was talked kind of into doing honours. And then after honours, I was asked if I wanted to apply for a scholarship for a PhD. And I was kind of like, why? Like, where am I going to go with this? So I realized that there were certain jobs I could do with a bachelor's degree, certain jobs and more skills that I'd learned with an honours. I wanted to do a PhD because I became very passionate about what I was working on. So I think there is no answer to that. It's wherever your passion takes you. So it could take you into the more practical side of things, working with Queensland Parks and Wildlife Services. It can take you into the management side or the science side. Just wherever your passion leads you, I think that would be enough for you. There is no right answer for everybody.
Thanks, Jess. Good response. Well, if there's no other comments from the panel, I will wrap it up there. Just a reminder though, that if you are wanting to learn more about biodiversity when you head out and visit the reef, there are those tourism operators that are considered high standard tourism operators. There's an accreditation scheme that the authority has in place. And if you'd like to learn any more about the high standard program or any of the work that the authority does or upcoming National Science Week sessions, I encourage you to visit our website, www.gbrmpa.gov.au. Otherwise, I thank you for joining us and I hope you have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.